All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the November 2023 Collaboration Cafe webinar, sponsored by the Midwest Big Data Innovation Hub, with support from the National Science Foundation. I'm John MacMullen, Executive Director of the MBDH, and today we'll be exploring an NIH training grant opportunity that's focused on big data. The program is led from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, one of the 27 institutes and centers at NIH. And NIH has a long history, actually, of funding innovative programs on data and informatics. And they now have an agency-wide Office of Data Science Strategy to help guide those programs as well. So to help us understand what this particular program is trying to do, we're very happy to have a program director with responsibility for this opportunity joining us today, Dr. Elizabeth Hoffman. Thank you so much for being here.
Sure. Happy to be here, and thanks for having me. So just a quick word of clarification. I'm actually not a program officer, so which is okay. I interact closely with program officers. I'm the associate director for the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, which is mainly out of NIDA, but there are about 8 or 9 other institute centers within NIH that also support the study and co-fund it. So just a little bit of background for me. And the reason I wanted to mention that is this R25 really grew out of what we were finding in ABCG study data analyses and analysis plans that we were seeing in the field emerge. So this is a big population study. It's around 12,000 participants that have been enrolled in the ABCG study. It's in its 8th year now, so we have lots and lots and lots of data, and we've embraced an open science model in this study. So the data are made available to the wider scientific community on a regular basis. And so given that this is an enormous undertaking, an enormous amount of data that spreads over multiple dozens really of domains of study, there are opportunities and we believe really responsibilities to understand how those how analyses should be done on population level data. What are the caveats that need to be considered? What are the particular statistical and analytic approaches that should be designed, developed, taken into account, modeling for population level data. One thing that if you've taken a look at this R25 that you may have noticed is there's a description in here about one consequence of dealing with population level data, which especially with the population level data in the ABCD study, which is that there can be a lot of heterogeneity in the data set. And so it isn't just, p-values anymore. We're looking at effect sizes because really with this amount of data, the significance level is going to be kind of a foregone conclusion for almost everything. And so the effect sizes are often small, but and we don't know what kind of how meaningful they are, right? So biological meaningfulness, clinical meaningfulness, statistical meaningfulness, these are all things that we grapple with, that you all grapple with too, of course, in these kinds of big data sets. And so given that population level neuroscience data is sort of relatively new compared to other things, and the availability of data is growing, it's really been democratized, I think, over the last 5 to 10 years. We saw an opportunity to, or a need rather, to provide an opportunity to new investigators or even not new investigators for helping them to achieve a level of expertise in working with these data and to help move the field forward in those ways that I mentioned a little bit ago. So that's just sort of a bit of background for this R25, and I don't have slides, but I'm happy to focus in on anything in particular. I could talk about the more specifics around what's expected in this in these applications. I'm not sure, John, if you have a particular focus for what you'd like me to speak about.
Yeah, absolutely. And so thanks very much for that initial context. And I think we're going to come back to the data sets that you talked about, because that is a big change in the past decade or so to have that publicly available collection of data that people can use. And there's some risks, as you all are pointing out in the solicitation around that. And so we'll come back to that in a little bit and talk about what NIH and NIDA in particular are thinking about here in terms of the scope of this solicitation. But I think I'll get us started with just a little background about what we're trying to do with this series. So for those of you who are not regular viewers, this is a monthly series that we run looking at primarily federal funding opportunities and helping to demystify that process and understand some of the opportunities for regional engagement here in the Midwest. And so we are an NSF-funded organization that's part of a national network funded by NSF for quite a few years now, really focused on building communities and collaborations around data science through events like this and other programs. And so for those who may be watching the recording of this in the future, if you're outside of our 12-state area in the Midwest, I encourage you to reach out to the hub that is in your geographic area to look for opportunities to get involved in their regional activities that may be of interest to you. Here in the Midwest, our organization is a partnership with 6 universities led from the University of Illinois, which is where I am based. And we have a number of priority areas and cross-cutting themes that are really driven by the regional community interest and strengths that we have here in the Midwest. And so today we'll be focused on a couple of those in particular. So big data in health is a core part of our mission, but also data science education and workforce development. So this particular funding opportunity aligns really well with both of those. Today is actually our 25th episode of this series. It's hard to believe that time has gone by that quickly, but we have covered these kinds of topics like this in the past, both on the biomedical data side and also on the workforce development side of that picture as well. So we've had some great guests from NIH previously to help us understand where the agency is headed in some of these directions. So we're really grateful to have you here today, Dr. Hoffman, as well. For those who may be new to NIH, we have a lot of folks in our network who are NSF awardees and proposers and USDA as well. NIH is a unique agency in terms of the way they structure their funding opportunities. And so you'll see the R prefix to a lot of program designations. Today, we're looking at the R25, which is focused on education and training, which is really one category of training offered by NIH. There are career development kinds of awards for faculty member and other postdoctoral status folks, as well as pre-doctoral training as well in different programs. So when you see those designations, you'll understand a little bit better what those mean, and those are categories of funding opportunities. You can also think about some of these being NIH-wide opportunities, like the R01, for example, and others. When you start looking at specific solicitations, R25 is a standard category across the institutes, but we're looking at one today led by one institute in particular. So there is that distinction. There are also some interagency programs, less prevalent, but there are some in particular with NSF around biomedical data and infrastructure. So lots of different potential opportunities to work with data and informatics with NIH. So we're going to focus today on the training program that Dr. Hoffman mentioned. This is something really focused on neuroscience data, but pretty wide range of possibilities in terms of what those data look like and what they're used for. The next due date for this program is in early February. There is an option for a letter of intent, which I believe is non-binding for this program, but it helps NIH plan and what to expect in terms of numbers of proposals and what kind of review panels they need to assemble for that. So that is due in early January. So if you're interested in proposing in this cycle. You've got a couple of months still to get that underway and submitted. This is a program that can extend up to 3 years with up to $300,000 per year in direct costs for that. Relatively small program. They're expecting up to 4 awards during this particular cycle. But the eligibility is pretty wide open. Faculty at higher education institutions and researchers, but also nonprofit organizations, government agencies, non-US entities are eligible as well. So if you have an interest in this space and you're not in a traditional higher education setting, keep this in mind because there may be opportunities for you with this program. I should note that these slides will all be available after the webinar today, and we'll post the recording on our YouTube channel as we always do. So you'll have access to this information after the call. So I'm not going to talk through every line that we have here. One thing that I find really helpful about NIH solicitations is their timeline that includes not only the submission, but also the review cycle so that you have a sense of when your proposal will be reviewed, and in particular, what's the earliest start date that you can put in that proposal and plan for if you are awarded. So in this particular case, proposals, as I said, are due in early February. They would get reviewed in the summer, and then September would be the earliest that you could start that project if you were awarded. So keeping that in mind, it's sort of a 8 or 9 month cycle that you have to be aware of and planning in relation to other work that you may have. So let's go back to what you were talking about earlier, Dr. Hoffman. You had mentioned some of the language in the solicitation around these new data sets that are available for use by the research community and really accessed by anyone. There's a number that NIH have been instrumental in leading and funding. And there's some language in the solicitation around the social determinants of health as being an emerging area of focus as well. And so I wanted to sort of drill down on this a little bit with you, because in the title and in the description, you're talking about responsible use of data and some of the challenges that are emerging where maybe the methodology is lagging a little bit, the access that we now have to this data. So can you speak to that rationale a little bit about what the foundation is seeing for the need here and the drivers behind that?
Yeah, so there are several, so really listed here in the rationale. So these are all statistical methodologies listed here: population inference, sampling variability, covariate inclusion, data missingness, all of which aren't new, of course, but they just have particular specific relevance, I think, for population level data. And so one thing I'll just mention there. So with population level studies, the inferring when you're pulling out a sample from that, of course, we hope to make representations to the population, but that presumes, I think, that the sample is nationally representative. And so that isn't always the case, and it's not the case with the ABCD study and the upcoming HBCD study. It's close, but it's not exact, and that's largely because all of these awards were made on a competitive basis, and so it's not possible to have a fully representative sample. And so that's something, from a statistical sense, that needs to be approached in careful ways. And then the issue around covariates, I can touch on that a little bit. So there's a tendency, I think, many of us in graduate school were taught to, include sort of almost in a rote sense, include race, ethnicity as covariates, include gender as a covariate, include everything up to the kitchen sink as covariates, without necessarily thinking through in a hypothesis-driven way why what is the benefit of including those variables as covariates and not variables of interest, for example. And so that becomes especially meaningful when you have a really large data set with tons and tons of data domains, and you're just throwing in all of these things, and then what do you get output from that? And if it's not hypothesis driven, if it's just sort of throwing things in because we think we've been taught that we need to do that without justifying, that can create problems, and that can result in, you know, findings and interpretations that are not necessarily in line with the intent. And so as an example, using, and this sort of gets to the responsible data use component, many analyses will throw race ethnicity in as covariates to a problem, to a model, without a justification for why. Covariating for race and ethnicity. And there may be reasons to do that, but there may be reasons not to do that. There may be reasons to stratify by race, ethnicity, or there may be other approaches that need to be taken into account. And so just to be careful and intentional and methods driven and hypothesis driven where possible, I think is something that's been a particular focus with these population level data sets. And then data missingness is similarly in the sense of they're sort of unique, I think, foci for dealing with population level data, is what to do about missing data within an individual, but also across. And so sort of thinking about random missingness versus non-random missingness or structured missingness, for example, and that's come up a lot in ABCD with, you know, lots of socio-demographic considerations that we have in this data set, taking time to look at, are there particular constructs, particular domains that are more prone to data missingness? For example, are there questions that are asked that are so sensitive that particular groups may not feel comfortable answering them? And so that's an empirical question, and those analyses are underway in ABCD to try to understand what the data missingness is attributed to. Is it random? Is it non-random? And then if it's non-random, what are the domains of study that are particularly prone, and which groups of respondents are more likely to have missing data? So it's much more complicated than what I've represented, but just to sort of highlight that here as something that we're looking for in terms of really having experts inform trainees, inform communities embarking on these kinds of analyses, that these are things that need to be addressed, and providing those educational opportunities so that folks feel like they're prepared to do those kinds of analyses.
Absolutely, that's very helpful, and it makes me think of some other related topics that we talk about a lot in data science. So, for example, ethical use of data, particularly involving AI, is a hot topic these days, but is really important, obviously, in the medical environment. You mentioned missing data, for example, but we often have challenges around having too much data, leading to being able to identify specific people, maybe in a study, or people within a very specific geographic area. And so thinking about data privacy and HIPAA compliance for data that we may be working with is part of that. But I think even at a higher level, we talk a lot about data literacy, and so understanding what your data looks like in terms of its features, and how to characterize it, how to interpret it. I feel like the statistical literacy that you sort of were talking about is a similar side of that coin, where more domain experts maybe are thinking about it from a statistical literacy point of view, and the data scientists are thinking about it from a data literacy point of view. But we're really talking about similar things, I think.
Yeah, two sides of the same coin for sure. And then just to draw this out a little bit more with the responsible and ethical use. So there's really two main components to that. So there's the being responsible from a statistical standpoint, and we sort of talked around many of those issues. And then there's the responsibility around how data are analyzed and interpreted with respect to systemic or structural factors that may be impacting findings as opposed to individual level factors. And so building in where possible, building in contextual level variables into statistical models that can help inform outcome measures. So to use the race and ethnicity example again, thinking about systemic and structural racism and what it means to be a Black person living in this country, and for example, neighborhood segregation could be something that has huge impacts on adolescent development in ABCD study. And so thinking about those kinds of high-level contextual variables and factors that could be much more informative and capture really in a much richer way predictors for outcome variables than the traditional, for lack of a better word, variables that we might otherwise put into a model. So thinking about those two ways of being responsible and ethical with data use, and then data interpretation. So another thing that I think we have here spelled out here is the value of listening to people with lived experience, reaching out to communities who are affected to really help to understand how to build data analytic models that sensitively reflect what is intended to be captured, and then thinking about then beyond that how the findings could then be interpreted, and what really can't be interpreted based on the findings from the data, the questions that are left unanswered.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that leads us back to the social determinants of health concept that is referenced in the solicitation as well. And that makes me think that a lot of these data sets can be really valuable on their own, and we can learn a lot from mining them and looking at them in new ways. But in a lot of cases, we want to look at multiple data sets that may be collected by different people at different times and using slightly different methodology in order to attack that question of how do certain factors impact health, particularly in underserved communities, for example. So I'm wondering if some dimension of this may come down to some of the features that we're interested in the data science world around metadata and integrating data sets in different ways and looking at how their values may or may not be comparable across different kinds of data sets. To what extent is this really a training program versus being able to include some of those more technical data science elements in the work?
I think that's fair game. I think that's a huge, something that we've talked a lot about at NIH is federating data sets and the enormous value for that. It hasn't, just really worked out. People haven't really worked out how to do that effectively. But I think that's, and with, you mentioned metadata and then, common data elements and all of these things, and you really have to drill down deep to figure out what it is that you're looking at. If you're going to be comparing data sets, are the elements the same across? And so I think that's hugely important, and I think would have a place here.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who has taught sort of data literacy kinds of courses previously, we would look at multiple data sets in terms of different factors like time. So data set A may be collecting on an hourly basis, and data set B is on a daily basis. Trying to rationalize how the data may be able to be integrated. And so I could certainly see that in some of the training elements that are possible here. And so maybe we can sort of shift into that side of the scope in terms of you have a couple of suggestions that you all have provided in the solicitation around courses that are focused on skill development in particular, but then more broadly curriculum or methods development. And so I'm wondering if you can talk through that distinction a little bit here. These are all focused on training, and so we have to have some actual training that occurs regardless of what we do here. But how are you guys seeing the distinction between maybe hands-on skill development versus more methodological curricula?
So I think that so courses for skills development. So these are designing courses and carrying out the instruction of the courses for development of these skills listed here and others that are proposed. We don't want to, we're not constraining any, so this is meant to be as broad as it sounds here, because I don't think we want to limit what you all might propose that you would want to do. So these are examples. It's not limited to these. And then curriculum or methods development, developing tools, developing instructional approaches separate from the actual conduct of the course, if that makes sense. And that just sort of reminds me, I think there was something in the chat about this, about the question of the interpretation of programs that may augment already existing training. So that's allowed. What's not allowed is any overlap. So if there's stuff going on already at your institution that's federally funded, that would kind of be a red flag, because NIH doesn't want to see any overlap. They're not going to fund something twice. So just wanted to put that out there.
I think we'll come back to that again in a bit later as well, where we talk about the budget and the scope of work, because if you have an institutional training grant already at your institution, that's fine, but you have to make this a distinctly different
exactly.
program, and it probably is going to be fundamentally different anyway, because this is more of a short-term training versus a funding your grad students for 3 years kind of model, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea here is that it provides an opportunity for graduate students or postdocs or whomever to develop the expertise to then be independent investigators and do analyses on big data, right? So it's short-lived in the scope of the award, but I would hope that it has long-term benefits to the folks that are on the receiving end of the courses and curriculum development. But yeah.
Great, and that sort of leads me to my next question, which is, I think in a lot of cases we view the NIH training grants as being for grad students or sometimes undergrads, and that's the case for a lot of NSF training as well. But what's the scope here in terms of restrictions? Can we include research staff, postdocs, people in core facilities, things like that?
This is not a training grant, so I think maybe that's a misunderstanding. This is an R25, which is an education resource grant, and so it's different from. It's not a training grant, so the awardee wouldn't be trainees necessarily. They would be receiving the instruction designed by subject matter experts. So it's different from the training grant designation. I just want to make sure that was clear, because that's a separate NIH grant designation.
Right. Yeah, and I should not have used that phrase, because it does have that special meaning at NIH. But in terms of the audience for the actual programmatic activities here,
from that, yes.
I'm thinking of people like core facility staff who may be doing biostatistics, or even local public health department staff, extension agents, even. Are those people who would be reasonable to include in that population of people?
There are no limits. If you can justify the need, then it's totally allowable. This is not restricted in any way in that regard.
Great, that's helpful. Ivo, thanks for your question. I want to encourage folks to put in questions in the chat at any time here, and we will get to those. You all have some great guidance in the solicitation. Again, not going to go through all the details here, but there's a lot of good detail about what the scope of intellectually what the scope looks like here. And so there's some really good examples of what is meant by the concept. And so, giving these very specific examples, I think, is helpful for people who may be trying to conceptualize what this would look like. So I don't know if you want to speak to any of this, but if you're proposing into this program and what you're doing is fundamentally different from the types of things you see here, you probably want to check with a program officer about whether this is appropriate for this particular program.
Yeah, and I was just going to add that we at NIH expect to hear from the community with questions, and so please reach out. It's generally people who are more successful in getting grants when they have interactions with program officers and others to help answer questions and generally frame specific aims that are in line and responsive to the mechanism. So I encourage you to reach out to me at any point in the process, and certainly when you have an aims page, we love to get those, and that's something for us to respond to and react to and have conversations.
That's great, and we do try to stress that on this series that it may be intimidating, particularly for early career folks, to reach out to a program officer, but that's a normal part of their daily job that you guys are all named in the solicitation, and that's for a reason. And so you know, you want to be prepared for that conversation. You want to have the list of specific aims, as Dr. Hoffman mentioned, or you want to have a one-pager in the NSF format that talks about broader impact and intellectual merit. But you know, that's a conversation that you should have if you have any concerns about the scope of what you're trying to do. All right, let's talk a little about what your budget looks like in terms of scope as well. So this program does allow costs for personnel, so people who are developing the intellectual content of these programs and maybe teaching courses, for example. There's some support for administration and consultants and mentors with some limitation there, but those costs are allowed, and so keep that in mind when you're thinking about what it costs to develop this work and who's going to do that. Participant costs are also allowed, and so there's some more specific guidance in the solicitation about that, but it is possible to provide some support to the people who are benefiting from the work that you're doing. As we mentioned earlier, though, this is not intended for funding students, for example, as a full-time kind of position. That's what the training grants, the institutional training grants and other mechanisms are for. This is not intended for that kind of approach. Any other things that folks should watch out for here in terms of allowable costs or restrictions?
No, I don't think so. I think you've captured everything here. Yeah, I think that's everything. Nothing I would particularly highlight beyond what you have already.
So another thing at the bottom here to be mindful of, you know, indirect costs have become really important to a lot of institutions in terms of supporting the underlying resources that are used for projects like this. But in this case, that is restricted to 8% of the direct costs with some adjustments that you'll probably find in your institutional spreadsheet for that. So this is not the typical institutional negotiated rate that you may see in other research focused kinds of projects. So just be mindful of that. You may have to check with your sponsored projects office since this is a deviation from a typical level of F&A. Let's talk a little bit about what your proposal would include. So typically in an NIH proposal, you'd have a research plan where you could talk about the specific research elements. This is not really a research kind of program in the sense of a basic R1, but there's a lot of very specific elements that NIH is looking for here. And so we're just capturing some of the bullets, but when you look at the solicitation, there's a lot of very good detail about what specifically the the program is looking for, and a lot of that has to do with the education program plan. What exactly are you proposing to do? How does that work? Who are the people involved? What kinds of resources from your institution are involved in that? How are you recruiting participants and ensuring that you have a diverse pool of people who are participating? How are you teaching them responsible conduct of research kinds of topics, which really is in line with the theme of responsible use of data, I think, in this case. How are you evaluating the outcomes of what you do, and how are you disseminating those findings to others who can benefit from that? So lots of things to think through and describe in detail for the reviewers here. I was wondering, Dr. Hoffman, if you could talk about the different institutional elements, because I see 3 of them in here. There's the letter of support from your institution and probably your department about committing to being the host institution for this activity. Then you have your facility statement, which a lot of times people will include a really long set of resources that may or may not be relevant to a particular project. And the way that I read this is that you all want to see the specific and relevant resources to this program that your overall institution has. But then there's some language about the institutional environment and commitment to sort of address anything that isn't covered in those other 2. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little about what you are looking to see there in terms of what's an institution that looks prepared to do this versus maybe not prepared at this point?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there may be, so I'm thinking of an example actually rather than a description, but somebody, a prospective applicant, raised a challenge, which was that they wanted to know if they could design courses and their institution didn't have the space, didn't have the commitment, as it says here, didn't put a value on something like this, so they didn't have the feasibility to do it, and they wondered if they could design a summer course in some other location, which presented some challenges. And so I think something like that would be maybe not responsive to this application. So I'm just looking at, I have to apologize that I haven't looked at that particular language in quite a long time, so I'm just looking back at the funding opportunity announcement myself. So I might just get back to you on that point with more fleshed out information, if that's okay.
That's totally fine.
I'll make a note to myself to do that.
Yeah, but I certainly understand the case that you're talking about, which sounds like it might be more appropriate for a workshop kind of proposal where it's a one-off activity in a short period of time versus this,
right,
which is more programmatic, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, we're really looking for something that is integrated and programmatic with demonstrated the capability for demonstrated efficacy at the end.
Mm-hmm. Right, and so when you're looking at that section of the solicitation, I'm trying to scroll there myself currently. Beyond the institutional elements about classroom space and other things like that, they're asking you about the program director, the PI. What are their qualifications? What have they done previously in this space, and what are they building on? The program faculty who are involved in this particular project, what are some of their skill sets and backgrounds? What do they contribute here that is differentiated from other people? What kinds of program participants are you trying to recruit for this? And so a lot of the detail that they're looking for is characterizing the people related elements and what's unique about your particular situation that would help move this space forward in terms of training your folks, but then learning from that and helping other people as well. So, as I said, a lot of really good detail in the solicitation around this part of the proposal. So definitely worth spending some time thinking through that. Otherwise, on the slide here, we have some more supplementary kinds of documents around resource sharing plans, thinking about how to recruit diverse participants and planning for addressing their involvement. A lot of good guidance there. An advisory committee is not required for this particular program, but if you do plan to have one, there's some good guidance in there as well. And I think NIDA, given its unique role with clinical trials and drug abuse and use kinds of situations, you have some of these special considerations that people may be wanting to be mindful of as well. Maybe not so much for this program, but I think some of that is applicable here too, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
All right, so you developed your proposal, you submitted it. What happens next? How are the reviewers looking at your proposal? So if you have submitted to NIH before, you know that there are some standard review criteria that are scored in different ways, and so that is documented in the solicitation as well. But there's also some additional criteria for this particular program that addresses again recruiting participants, what they're learning. Some of these elements come right back to the different elements of the project description as well. So those line up quite nicely, but there's some optional ones if you're in a particular space where you're using animals for research or human subjects or biohazards as well. All right, so that is pretty much everything that I wanted to walk through for folks. As I said, the slides will be available. I went out to Reporter and pulled down just a few other R25s that have some data and workforce elements to them. None of these were funded through NIDA, and so these are not necessarily the same things that we're talking about with this solicitation, but people who want to see what else has been funded in a similar kind of space might have a look at some of these that were funded by different institutes. These are all in the Midwest here, and so we try to feature awards that are in our region and folks you could reach out to and talk with about your ideas, potentially even look for new collaborators in this space as well. So I think it's always good to see what has already been funded, and that helps you scope your work a little bit as well. I don't know if you know any of these awards, Dr. Hoffman, or if you can mention any that have been made through this program that people could look at, but that's sort of where we are at this point.
Not yet, actually. So don't have any information about this particular award recipients yet.
Is this the first cycle for this program?
This is the second cycle, I believe.
Okay. Great. So before we get into the discussion and Q&A session here, I wanted to mention that this series will continue in 2024. And so if folks who are watching in the recording would like to suggest topics or guests for us to bring on next year, we'd be happy to hear from you. We're always looking for what the community is interested in learning about. In that vein, as we talk about demystifying federal funding and how to grow capacity in the Midwest for funding opportunities, particularly at smaller institutions, I wanted to mention that the NSF annual grants conference is coming up at the beginning of December. That is a free opportunity for folks to learn about the whole cycle at NSF of funding opportunities. And so take a look at that if you would like to learn more there. But we're always happy to hear more from you about your interests and your needs around funding. we have a pretty small group here online, so we may not have a full-scale discussion here, but I had a few conversation starters if people would like to get into a discussion here. I just wanted to note that we can't give you feedback on a specific proposal idea that you have today. That's a great opportunity to reach out to your program officer to have that conversation. But in general, we can talk about other questions today. Like I said, we have a small group online, and so we probably won't have the discussion about regional needs today, but we're happy to do that with folks going forward. I know Arngard and JD are actually on my team. If you guys have questions, feel free to join in. Mohammed, do you have any questions for our guests? All right, well, we may wrap up a little bit early today then. Dr. Hoffman, I really appreciate you coming on. It was great to meet you and have a little more context about what this program is trying to do. And we appreciate your being here and telling us about where things are headed with this program.
Absolutely, my pleasure. And please feel free to reach out anytime with any follow-up questions or if I can help with anything else as you're moving forward.
Great. Thanks very much, everybody. We'll look forward to seeing you on our next call.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.